Hi, and welcome to, we're at Chapter 14, Part 1. Now, this is a short overview of unintentional and intentional injuries. Now, we are exposed to, and sometimes we experience injuries, so even though we don't plan to be injured, injuries are often preventable and even predictable. So let's get started with this, and we're going to begin with unintentional injuries, and then we'll go to intentional. Okay, unintentional injuries. So why accidents happen? Now again, I'm going to be doing a quick overview about unintentional injuries, and there's serious public health concerns in Canada. Now, of course, when we think in terms of unintentional, well, transportation accidents, falls, drowning, fires, burns, and unintentional poisoning and sports are some of the most common. And maybe you or I certainly have experienced some of these or know people who have. But there are many non-fatal injuries results in disabilities and physical impairments such as blindness, spinal cord injuries, excuse me, and brain injuries. And this can include, excuse me, this can include, in terms of brain injuries, concussions and post-concussion syndrome. And the majority of unintentional injuries are not only preventable, but they can be predictable. Now, this has certainly touched my life quite significantly, as it may have in some of your lives. I have a friend of mine who dove in our swimming pool when we were just in first year university, Jeff, and he broke his neck in our pool. Diving in, hit his head on the bottom, unintentional, predictable in that it wasn't a particularly deep, and we had dove in that pool many times, but this particular time, he landed on his head and broke his neck. So it was preventable and it was predictable. Many of us have probably had other types of examples not unlike that. And it, of course, affected his life until he passed away just last year. And so when we look at unintentional, they can be much more minor. I've twisted and broken my ankles many times. I had knee surgery. They're not intentional. They're sports related, but they can have an impact on one's life, some more than others. So, what are some of the factors that can affect unintentional injuries? Well, one's age can play a big role regarding injuries. The young and seniors are at the greater risk. Now, injuries are a leading cause of death for Canadians between the ages of 1 and 44. Now, when you think in terms of injuries that can occur in our youth, lots of things from falls, slips, injuries in sports, accidents where you're the passenger. And a third leading cause of death in that age group for all Canadians are injuries. Now, for seniors, the most significant, most common injury are falls. And there is a lot of research going on currently around how to help seniors prevent falls, from the types of shoes they wear, the attachments to canes and walkers that might prevent falls, building homes, people's homes for seniors to age in place where they have all those additional preventative strategies built into the home to reduce the likelihood of falls so seniors can age at home rather than be in long-term care. All right, age. So what else? Well, if you're stressed out or sleep deprived, you pose a greater risk to yourself and others. And that just makes sense. You're not at your best. You're not cognitively thinking straight. You're oftentimes preoccupied in your mind, which is why you might, as you're going downstairs, think you're at the bottom, and then bang, you've taken an extra 2 steps and find yourself falling and maybe hurting yourself. So if you're out skiing and snowboarding and you've been sleep deprived and you're stressed out or tired, you might not react as quickly as you think when you're trying to make that turn or stop and find yourself entering the trees. Now, We can also consider thrill-seeking as an explanation for unintentional injuries. Parachuting, base jumping are examples of stimulating, no doubt, but some maybe are more interested in that than others. However, along with that thrill-seeking, there may be a lower, for some people at least, may have a lower than normal levels of brain chemicals that regulate excitement, which is why they increase or ramp up the thrill-seeking in order to get the same response that you and I might get out of something a little less spectacular. In some cases, taking risks can enhance personal well-being. So it's a balance around how much risk do we take, and also how many precautions do we take. I mean, it's one thing to go skiing or snowboarding or participate in a fast-moving activity, but to not wear the appropriate preventative and safety precautions and helmets, that's taking a risk, that's putting it outside the norm. So intentional injuries, now we're going to touch on this one. This is a little different, and intentional injuries is living in a dangerous world. Now, the World Health Organization, WHO, describes intentional injuries as interpersonal violence that can cause homicide, sexual assault, neglect, abandonment, suicide, and war. Now, some people or groups of people are more vulnerable to intentional injuries than others, and living in unsafe environments can raise these risks. Now, many of us might not find ourselves in some of those areas where some of the intentional risks for injuries can occur. However, there are, and we may know people who have been affected by intentional injuries. Suicide is probably one of the more significant ones. Suicide and other forms of self-harm are a leading cause of all intentional injury deaths. Now, we're going to review some categories of intentional injury. This course and chapter will only be highlighting key trends, not exploring the correlational explanations for these trends. So we're going to begin with violence in Canada. In Canada, the police reported crime rate and the crime severity index have both been decreasing between 2013 and 2014. Now, you can look in your textbook there on page 390, figure 14.3. Now, you'll notice the green line, which is the violent crime, might be lower than you thought it was. Now, it's been, if we were to extend this back to 1990, that green line there will have dropped significantly to get to where it is. There's been a huge decrease in violent crime from about 1995 downward, and so from 2013 to 2014, we still see it degrading. So it might be in part that we get a lot of attention in the news media that makes it appear like violent crime is much higher, but actually it's fairly low. Now, males, unfortunately, but still account for the majority of criminal offenses. However, it's interesting to note that the rate of female offenses has been increasing. Please note that police-reported crime does not include non-reported crime, which can in some categories be larger than reported crime. Many people don't report crime. The incidents, the statistics when they are put in Stats Canada or collected by sociologists are those stats that can be recorded and documented. And so when it comes to crime in particular, whether it be family violence, sexual assault, or violent crimes generally, if they're not reported, they're not counted. And so we need to keep in consideration that when we look at statistics for things like this, they are based on what is reported. Let's touch base on family violence. Now, police-reported violence against family members has declined by about 16% between 2009 and 2014. However, it's important to remember that family violence is often not reported. And this is very important when it comes to crimes in particular, or crimes generally, but family violence and sexual assault in particular, is that a lot of the crimes are not reported. So when we look at stats, they are representative, and I'm emphasizing this, they're representative based on those that have been reported to police. But the incidence of which those crimes occur could be, in some cases, much higher depending upon the crime. In 2014, common physical assault accounted for the greatest proportion of family violence, with major assault being the next most frequent reported offense, and the majority of the victims, as you might expect, are young girls and women. Where it touches you perhaps now, maybe not as much on Owen Sound, but it would help, but we would look at it generally, is crimes on campus. Now, while most colleges and university campuses provide a safe environment for living and studying, there are reports of increasing crime rates. Property crimes such as burglary and theft are the most common, and cyberbullying is certainly on the rise. Now, due to concerns about safety on campus, more schools are taking tougher stands on student behavior by establishing codes of conduct, barring the use of alcohol and drugs, and addressing sexual harassment, racism, homophobia issues. And some have even instituted policies regarding suspensions or expulsions for students who violate these codes. And you'll find that at Georgian that there are codes for student conduct and for the protection of people and the supports in place to help with that. Now, many campuses have set up public safety initiatives and sexual assault services, providing counseling, crisis intervention, education programs. For most students, crime is committed by students themselves. Now, another form of intentional danger, if you will, is what's known as hate crimes. In recent years, we've seen a slight reduction in violent crimes motivated by hatred of a particular person's race, religion, or sexual orientation. Now, hate crimes are related to race and ethnicity are still a great concern. Most common types of hate crimes violations include mischief or vandalism, assault, uttering threats, and hate propaganda and physical force using weapons such as knives and pellet guns is becoming, unfortunately, more common in some campuses. Many administrators at Canadian colleges and universities are denouncing hate crimes and doing more to educate faculty, staff, and students about this issue. Now, it's at this point here I want to point out the next area that your chapter is covered. I want you to review this more on your own. Because of the way I do my online class and the number of images that I use, I've considered this topic quite a bit on sexual assault and violence. And I feel like this may not be the best place to do this in an online environment with images. It can be acting as a trigger for those who may have had some bad experiences. And I don't want to trigger some of those experiences for people. So I'm aware of the topic. It's very difficult for some. And I encourage anyone who struggles with this topic to please visit Student Services and take advantage of the very good and caring supports that can be provided there. Now, this content, we're going to still use this content. You still should review it in the comfort of your own home and at your own pace. And I'll still include some questions on the test, but it'll be a reduced number. So I'm aware of how important and this topic, and I encourage you to increase your own awareness and supportiveness to one another in regards to sexual violence and violence. All right, so that's the end of part 2. I hope you enjoyed this, and carry on and be good to one another. Bye now.